And
Well, that's beautiful.
one thing we do not have in this old house are bookcases. So as you see,
Oh,
kinda
goodness.
like a lot of
That
books
is really,
piled on the floor.
that is very interesting how that's,
Yeah, no, so yeah, this was, I mean, I have a few civil, Middle East mementos. This was when Saddam invaded Kuwait and made it the 19th province of Iraq. They brought in license plates like a new state. Well, actually, this is a dry town. Half of Martha's Vineyard is dry.
Really?
Not for church reasons. I think it was just that after Prohibition, used to be a lot of like Vineyard Haven where you came in. Used to be a lot of sailors, and used to be real ports. And I think the residents kind of liked that the drunken sailors weren't around.
Tony, thanks for being with us, and give us a bit of your background. I mean, you're from, I like to say you're from Brown to a barn. So how did you do that? You ended up in a barn from an Ivy League school. Like, what happened? Was that a good thing, a bad thing?
Yeah, it's a nice barn, or it will be when we fix it up.
We're going to look at it soon. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know. I grew up in Washington, D.C. area, but went to Brown University in Rhode Island, and am now, as the crow flies, not very far from there, here on Martha's Vineyard. And we're fixing up the barn out back, and that will be my writing space. And I like to have a little separation from the house when I'm working. Ideally, you don't feel like your work is, the computer is there glowing as you go to bed, or, reading to your kids at night. You can have a little separation. So put me in the barn. My wife might say that's appropriate.
So if someone were looking at all your books, let's just say the books now, because we're going to talk about your journalism background some maybe a little bit later, but your books, could someone say, Tony's really into adventures and the Civil War? And that's all he writes on is adventures and the Civil War. Would that somewhat corral all your work? I mean, is there something about adventures and Civil War that pulls you?
Adventures, certainly until the most recent book, were all adventures. Certainly not around one of them around the Civil War, others in Australia, the Pacific, the Middle East, other places. So only one of those previous adventures was around the Civil War. And then now I've come back to the Civil War era, but in a different fashion. It's I hope a narrative adventure, but I'm not in it as an adventurer. So this book was, a little bit of a departure. My first book that's not my own personal adventure as well.
And this is the book we're discussing, Midnight Rising. John Brown and the raid that sparked the Civil War. The subtitle already, I want to get to why John Brown, why were you attracted to writing a book on him, but what did in fact start the Civil War? Because some people would say, you informed me, I didn't know, but that today is celebration, anniversary, how you want to look at it, Fort Sumter, right? Most people, or a lot of people maybe would say that's the beginning of the Civil War. Others, Frederick Douglass, right, you mentioned in the book, said, no, this is what John Brown, Harper's Ferry. I guess it's a big question, but what are your leanings on that? Who's right?
Yeah, I mean, it's too big an event and too complex an event to say there was any one spark. I mean, so perhaps my subtitle is a little overstated in that regard. Actually, I would say the Civil War begins in 1776. This contradiction that's built into the founding of America, where all men are created equal and have certain inalienable rights, unless they're at that time the 15% who were enslaved, and that's the smoldering issue beneath the surface all through that long period in the run-up to the Civil War. So I would say, in a sense, that's the real beginning. When you get into John Brown's raid, I mean, I would also argue Kansas, in which he was also involved. You're sort of into that Sarajevo question with World War I. Yes, well, Archduke Ferdinand being assassinated was the trigger for World War I, but you wouldn't say it caused the war. There was a long lead up, and I would feel the same with the Civil War. I guess the way I see it is that all through the 1850s in particular, you have this tension building in the country, this sort of kindling piling up around the nation. And at Harper's Ferry, John Brown really lights the match. So there, it was happening in all kinds of ways, but he really sort of lights this bonfire that certainly hastens the Civil War.
Right.
Again, I think it's too simplistic to say it causes the war, but it's one of those key events in the lead up.
And you said 1776, I think back to the work of Joe Ellison, Founding Brothers. He mentions that thing that you mentioned, I think Jefferson in the book, saying, hey, this is not going away. We have to, we've got something to deal with here.
Right.
And ironically, John Brown saying something pretty similar, that this is not going away. This is going to cause all kinds of friction, upheaval. And what attracted you to John Brown? I mean, obviously Civil War is rich with characters, events, battles. Why him? I mean, you've done a book, obviously Confederates in the Attic. Why a biography on really focused on a person in his times and stuff?
Well, the earnest answer would be that, he's just a tremendously important figure, and that this sort of fills in a piece, or at least did for me, that I think Civil War buffs like myself too often ignore. We tend to focus very narrowly on the 1861 to 65 period, the great leaders and battles, and we don't often sort of step back and say, how is it that this slaughter occurred in the first place? How is it that Americans, who for the most part shared a common religion, culture, language, many other things, killed each other by the hundreds of thousands in the 1860s? And to me, John Brown and his raid are a window into that story. The less earnest answer is that really it's my wife's fault. My wife, Geraldine Brooks, is a historical novelist, and while she was researching her novel March, which is about Louisa May Alcott's father, or based on him, from Little Women, she found out that he, Bronson Alcott, Louisa May's actual father, had had a lot of contact with the Secret Six, who were John Brown's innermost core of supporters. And she basically came to me and said, this is a great story. You're a Civil War bore. Not many people know about this. You should write a book on these guys.
Wow.
And that really set me off on the research. She kind of nagged me really into researching the Secret Six. And ultimately, I decided I did not want to write a book about the Secret Six, although they're certainly appear in my book. They're interesting figures. But it really drew me to the larger story of John Brown and his raid and its significance.
And she's got a little credibility, not only as your wife, but isn't March what she won the Pulitzer for?
Yeah.
Okay, so you're thinking, okay, well, she got a little credibility. She got a Pulitzer Prize for this book. I gotta at least give her some deference. She ever use that in conflicts?
But
like, honey, remember I got the Pulitzer for this thing?
She got it for making stuff up. She's writing fiction. So, I mean, I love March, and it's a great book, but I wouldn't say that weighed on me in terms of, is this a nonfiction story that I want to tell? And if anything, in the end, I think what I came to realize researching the Secret Six is that they're classic Geraldine characters. They're the kind of people she loves to write about. These tortured idealists who strive and fail to live up to their ideals. I mean, these guys are not profiles in courage in the end. They're fascinating, but they're very flawed people. And John Brown's a different figure. He's really a man of action, not just of words. And I think, again, I find them fascinating, but I was more drawn to John Brown.
And I think your book does a great job of not being a caricature or a stereotype of Brown. I think your book does a great job of really showing this is a very complex guy. And he's got, as we'll get to, some things that are very virtuous and then some things that are really dark. And John Brown wasn't always predisposed to be militant. You talk about some movement, maybe Kansas, his time there, and some factors that led to it. What happened? Unpack that some of the kind of his progression there.
Yeah, he's sort of unusual for a radical in that his real coming out as a militant abolitionist is in his mid-50s. That's not the usual profile for a firebrand. He has a long life before then, a struggling businessman, a family man with a lot of personal setbacks. So to a degree, I think he's radicalized by his times. His life coincides really with the explosion of King Cotton. And the march of the cotton and slave empire out of what was, at the time he was born, really South Carolina and Virginia and Maryland and a few other states into what became the Confederacy. And you really see a period in which cotton not only wields enormous economic power, but political power. Virtually all the presidents through the first half of the 19th century are slave owners, some are cotton growers. Supreme Court is dominated by slaveholding Southerners. He's seeing all that happen, and he's not the only one, but I think he's responding to his times to a great degree.
Now a lot of people that know a little bit about John Brown might say, oh, okay, I get it. He's like a Timothy McVeigh, a Ted Kaczynski figure. You say no, that would be an error. Why?
Yeah, I think we have a tendency in America to turn people who commit acts of political violence into sort of crazed lone gunmen. That makes the rest of us more comfortable because these are shocking acts. You want to say, well, let's put them over here. They're not like us. In the case of John Brown, the common line is, yeah, he was crazy. I don't, feel that's fair to him. For one, he wasn't alone. I mean, Ted Kaczynski appears to have been truly alone. Timothy McVeigh had a few allies. Brown had scores of allies, many of them very prominent Northerners. He was the head, really, of a militant underground. So I think that argument or that way of seeing him has really just been a way of putting him on the fringes of American society and not taking what he did or what he believed very seriously. And if you look at his life, he actually was a quintessential American. An entrepreneur, a devout Christian, a family man. He was not, some sort of freak who came out of nowhere in the mid-19th century. He came out of the deep soil of his nation. Both his grandfathers fought in the Revolutionary War. He was descended from Puritans. He felt very much that he was fulfilling the American destiny, not somehow coming from the outside to change it.
So not the loner persona that, say, a McVeigh or Kaczynski would be.
Far from a loner, he fathered 20 children by 2 wives. An awful lot of them died, but I mean, this is a man who had a large brood. He had an enormous extended family. He had a huge network of supporters. So no, in no sense was he a lone gunman. No.
And we'll get to actual events at Harper's Ferry a little bit later, but it is amazing. You said the 50s. Here he is, 59, almost 60, with the Harper's Ferry thing. I mean, that kind of shocked me. I always envisioned a younger man. There were those who obviously were very sympathetic with his anti-slavery posture. Frederick Douglass, I'm thinking of in particular. And you've got some real helpful section there on that interaction of Douglass saying, I don't think, to John Brown, your tactics of what you're thinking about doing is the best way to go. Why?
Frederick Douglass just doesn't like the plan. I mean, I would say first we only have Douglass's version of events because, spoiler alert here, Brown fails in his raid on Harper's Ferry and is hanged, and most of his men die. So the meeting that Douglass describes, there are four men there, and he's the only one who survives. But I do believe Douglass's account because it's consistent with everything else we know. That he, like others, tremendously admired Brown's moral courage, his commitment to overthrowing slavery, but thought his plan just wasn't going to work. And I think Douglass knew as a a former slave himself, that if he went along as Brown wanted, that his chances would not be very good. But as he put it, he felt Brown and his men were walking into a steel trap in Harper's Ferry and would never get out, and he was proved right.
You will see, the camera can't see it, but I have wow next to a number of things in your book, but the Scottish gentleman who says this about Brown: I had seen the predestined leader of the second and holier American Revolution. And then also, as you'll see another wow, you can say, yes, Dave, it does have two wows there. Thoreau. Now, some people would say, okay, so that's a guy, I never heard of this Scottish guy. Who is this?
James Redpath.
Yeah, who is he? Who cares about him? But then, to my surprise, we talked off camera about Thoreau and Emerson, you've got this great quote here from Thoreau: he could not have been tried by a jury of his peers because his peers did not exist. Wow.
Yeah. This
amazing.
Man bred rather ferocious admiration from all kinds of quarters. James Redpath, the first quote you read, was an ardent propagandist. He was a fervent abolitionist who saw in Brown an agent of his own belief system, and I feel he's a critical player in the sort of creation of John Brown as a public figure. Thoreau is a different matter, of course, but also just sort of incidental things you find in people's writings about him. Two of my favorites are Bronson Alcott, the transcendentalist, calling him the manliest man I've ever met.
Wow.
He kind of stirs the blood of these rather genteel New Englanders. And then a woman who writes about what she calls his moral charisma. He did have this effect on people that caused them to really kind of bubble over with this kind of praise.
Wow.
So he was clearly quite remarkable in the personal impact he had on people.
Okay. Now, you told me that you don't get much TV, so I don't know if you've seen or heard of the show Swamp People. You ever seen that show?
Sorry, I haven't.
Okay, Louisiana reality show. They go and wrestle alligators. No. These are gnarly looking guys, okay, as we would say. We used to play this game, with the boys, and we'd say, okay, basically who's tougher, who's wiser, who's whatever more. So I said one time, okay, Swamp People fight Al Qaeda. Who wins? They go, Dad, no brainer. Swamp People. Okay. Swamp People fight the Secret Service. That's a tough one, but probably Secret Service, because they're kind of, they look kind of like these executive guys, but they got some spooky abilities. Right. So I wanted to extend it to you and say, and then Secret Service fight John Brown. Right. You would say what? Well, because you're talking about Bronson Alcott saying he was like this really tough guy.
But in the end, I would go with the Secret Service. Okay. Only because Brown's strength was not actually as a military tactician. Right. Yeah, he was a tough dude. I mean, here's a guy in his 50s who's living rough, forms this guerrilla army. No, he was a very tough man. But I think the great irony of his story ultimately is that he's very contemptuous of mere talkers and writers. He thinks this is what he calls milk and water abolitionism. His view is action, action, action. Enough with words. But in the end, he fails in his actions in Harper's Ferry. But he triumphs through the power of his words.
Yeah, there's an profound irony. I thought that was really interesting. Here's a guy that thinks there's power in the sword over the pen, but ironically, it was his pen that you could argue had more effect than his sword.
Speech. Yes, he turned out to be a brilliant writer and speaker. Not necessarily he wasn't a learned man. He didn't write like Thoreau. Right. It was sort of the plainness and force of his words that really transformed him from a kind of somewhat wild-eyed fellow with this scheme of his into a national figure, and in the eyes of many Northerners, a martyr, really a Christ figure. And that was really his words, not the sword. So he talked a good game, and he knew how to carry himself as this Cromwellian warrior. But I wouldn't put him up against the Swamp People in a scrap.
Okay. And with Emerson, was curious about that to me, is that on one hand it makes sense that Emerson, if I'm reading him properly, would like John Brown because of self-reliance and kind of my way or the highway, breaking away from tradition. But that kind of then starts morphing into the thing that raises like, wow, it's interesting, you get this austere kind of Calvinist guy, and then you got Emerson who's breaking away from everything that represents. But yet there is still so much left of Brown, I guess, in Emerson's estimation. He goes, well, this is still compelling. Right. This is compelling.
Well, also with Thoreau, who we think of as a pacifist, civil disobedience, here embracing, a man who feels, blood must be spilled. So there are all kinds of contradictions in that. To me, it speaks to the anger that was building in anti-slavery Northerners by this point, or by the point of the Harper's Ferry raid. They are so infuriated with the slaveholding South and the way in which it seems to be bullying the nation, that here's a guy that stands up to that, that they sort of, to some degree, adjusted their beliefs to embrace the elements of him that you mentioned, self-reliance, following his own drummer, etc., and sort of putting to the side some of the other aspects, his quite conservative Christianity, other aspects that maybe they wouldn't have seen eye to eye.
Which, of course, his sons did as well, right?
Right. Most of his followers did not share his quite staunch Calvinism. But they came together really over their militant opposition to slavery. So it's a little bit of that enemies make strange bedfellows. Brown brought together a rather motley crew of supporters and fellow travelers who shared this burning commitment to overthrowing slavery, but were otherwise totally unlike each other.
So Lincoln's, how did he view, say, the John Browns of the whole abolitionist movement?
Right. John Brown's raid occurs during the run-up to the 1860 presidential election, and Lincoln at that point is a sort of distant contender for the Republican nomination. And he, like other candidates, really has to take a stand on what's happened. This is a real shock to the nation. And Lincoln is actually very critical of Brown. He says we can admire his devotion to opposing slavery, but this is not the way to do it. This is not what the Republican Party is about. And Lincoln is really not an abolitionist. He's anti-slavery. Abolitionists want to abolish slavery in the South immediately. Lincoln opposes its extension to the West. So he's really a very moderate figure. He thinks slavery should be sort of left to wither away on its own, and that once freed, blacks should be resettled in Africa or Latin America because they could never live as equals to whites in this country. That was Lincoln's view. What's fascinating about Lincoln is that he evolves in office. So that this man who initially criticizes Brown, and this criticism really helps him get elected. He seems like the safely moderate choice in the Republican field. In the course of the Civil War really comes around to John Brown's point of view that slavery indeed needs to be overthrown by force. And like Brown, he pays the price. And really, to me, his assassination by John Wilkes Booth, who was present at John Brown's hanging 6 years before, are really the bookends of this national bloodletting over slavery.
One thing I mentioned earlier, and I want to get to now, that I think your book is really good at doing is, a John Brown figure is easy to caricature, easy to stereotype. And I think the popular view probably, usually people that maybe know a few things, it's easy for stereotypes to exist. But you got on one hand this man who's very compelling. He's kind to black people. He has them in his home. He's educating them, teaching them the Bible. He's kind to Indians. And so you're going, wow, that's amazing. And yet, toward the end, in his 50s, obviously, as he's kind of come into a more militant position, he could be brutal, you know, as far as some of the stuff that they did early on, even before Harper's Ferry, and killing people and stuff, ruthless. And so you see these, like, wow, these vices and virtues juxtaposed. How do you make sense of that? I'm curious, as you worked on this, maybe a two-parter of sorts, how did your own view of Brown, like, did you find yourself, I'm dumbfounded going into the book, and I'm hoping I'll be less dumbfounded when I get out, I'm spit out at the end, but here I am at the end, and I write the book, and I'm talking about him all over the country, and I go, I'm still kind of dumbfounded over John Brown, and I'm supposed to be the expert on John Brown.
Well, I mean,
So,
I think it was one
straight.
reason I wanted to write about him is that what struck me in reading the literature on John Brown, there have been many excellent biographies, other books that have touched on him. This man seems to drive historians bonkers.
Yeah.
They end up either wanting to sort of, or wishing they had been there charging with him into Harper's Ferry, or wishing they'd been up on the scaffold fitting the noose around his neck. There seemed to be no middle ground. And I really felt Brown is, you just can't fit him into those pigeonholes of either sort of martyr and hero or, you know, monster and villain. He's much more complex than that. All human beings are. Very few human beings fit either of those extremes. But certainly, as I was researching the book, I found myself constantly being tugged one way or the other. As you said, there are moments where you tremendously admire this man and his courage and his moral fiber, and other moments where you think, oh my God, the way he's treating his family or his use of violence in the conflict, particularly in Kansas. So I can't say I came to an easy answer with that. I guess what I would say is, in the end, I feel we have to embrace this man in all his complexity. That really, that's sort of his greatest historical value. There was a novelist, Truman Nelson, who 50 years ago described John Brown as the stone in the shoe of American history.
Interesting, wow.
Which I love. You know,
That's a good
he's
metaphor,
this irritant who is always there. We can't shake him out, we can't ignore him, but we also can never really be comfortable with him.
Right.
And I think that's his value. He forces us to keep asking those tough questions. Do the ends ever justify the means? When does an individual have the right to defy their government? All of these hard questions, he forces us to keep asking them. So that's maybe a little bit of a dodge of your question. But that's what I came away with.
It's shocking, too, to see, again, all these things that you tend to think about as would be certainly disconnected in any one person. Like my stereotype of sorts of John Brown, of us, you know, this guy who was very much bent toward the end of his life of being, you know, ruthless and whatnot. That scene that you paint toward the end of your book where he's going to the gallows to be hung, sitting on his coffin, and he's looking around going, well, this is a really lovely place, isn't it? And you're like going, are you serious? You kind of expect this guy screaming and yelling, what are you guys doing to me? This is unjust. And yet there he is just pondering the beautiful pastoral scene. He's about to go off on this farm and be hung in public, and he just seems absolutely at peace. And of course he was with what he did, but persona-wise seems to be just a very like laid-back kind of guy. You kind of picture this firebrand, and yet
I wouldn't call that laid back.
Okay,
I think it was that he was unbelievably staunch to the end.
Confident he had done what was right.
He struggled with it. I mean, nobody goes to, you know, he had a good 6 weeks to think about his hanging. And it's not that he didn't struggle with that, but he is determined to go out with absolute courage. And even the people who hated him, the Virginians sitting there watching his hanging, were stunned by you know, what one of them described as, you know, the greatest animal courage I've ever seen, that he could stand on the gallows, because actually his hanging took quite a while. And he had to stand up there, you know, with the noose around the neck and the hood over his head. He was genuinely remarkable that way, and it was really in the manner of his dying. That is a big part of the story.
Right.
He realized that his own death was, in a sense, going to fulfill what he had failed to do at Harper's Ferry, and he was determined to carry that through to the end. So I don't think he's laid back on that ride out to the gallows. He is just being the man he is determined to be right to the end of, I will not flinch. I will never flinch from what I have done.
Tony, why Harper's Ferry? I'm sure a lot of possible spots that Brown must have pondered, you could go to. Why there? Why at this time? Why was that the place where he thought this is really strategic?
The strategic theory in attacking Harper's Ferry is that this is one of only 2 federal armories in the whole country at the time, has 100,000 guns. It's at really the edge of the slave-holding South. It's in the mountains. The idea is you go in, seize these guns, begin to free slaves, and then sort of retreat into the mountains, and then continue south along the spine of the Appalachians in this rolling campaign of liberation. Also, it's quite close to the north so that you can have a staging area that's safe before you attack Harper's Ferry. My own view is that none of this makes tremendous sense strategically. This is a small industrial town. It's not a typical southern town. There are very few slaves in Harper's Ferry. That this also has a lot to do with theater. Everything Brown does throughout his abolitionist career has a degree of theater to it. He's really something of a master of public relations. And I think the other reason he chooses this is because of its symbolic value. This is a symbol of American power, just 60 miles from the Capitol. To seize that and declare that we are going to overthrow slavery in the South, in 1859 terms, was very roughly equivalent to attacking the trade towers, not in the mission. I don't want to equate the two morally or politically, but in terms of your impact, it's kind of a wow moment. And I think that's what he wanted more than anything. He wanted to sort of shake the country and force it to confront this issue and to bring on the great conflict that he felt was necessary to end slavery.
What's been the legacy since John Brown's death through different periods of American history since? Is he getting kind of a resurgence, more popular today among people saying, no, he really was a hero, or no, he really was a villain, or no, he's too complex to put in? I mean, is there a research? Because you see that with different characters, people in history, where there'll be a period where no one, you look at doctoral dissertations, no one's talking about them. Then all of a sudden there's tons of them. How about John Brown? What's
he's been on this 150-year roller coaster since his death, where during the Civil War in the North, at least, he's a great hero, and that lasts for a while. He's a symbol of the Union cause. When sort of segregation and Jim Crow sets in, he becomes somewhat of that villain madman school. What's fascinating to me is that over the years he's embraced by extremes both right and left. So anarchists in the late 19th century, Black Panthers embrace him, but then in recent decades, Timothy McVeigh and anti-abortion.
McVeigh
mentions him, and anti-abortion bombers in particular have embraced him and stood up in court and essentially quoted his own courtroom speech, essentially saying that my individual conscience and my sense of right trumps law and government, etc. So he's got this very complicated legacy. I would say since the, say, 1970s, there's been a gradual re-embrace of him, a more positive view after a long period in which he was viewed quite negatively. I would say, at least in the academic community, the view has gotten increasingly positive, that here was a man whose views of race in particular were just way ahead of their time, and a willingness to really embrace him as a hero.
I want to circle back, kind of in closing, to one thing that you mentioned. And interesting in your book how here this man of action, really as a man of action, we could say he was a pretty big failure, and yet as a man of the verbal written word was a surprising success in ways that even he never knew because of obviously the legacy of those words. What does that tell us again about the old adage, the power of the pen being greater than the power of the sword? Is there a lesson there that's really kind of an organizing theme that we can see that there is a lot of power to the written word?
Certainly. I'm not sure I would want to take that example and say, therefore, the pen is mightier than the sword. Right. We needed the sword of the Civil War to sort of fulfill Brown's mission. But I think it also speaks to a different era. He was able to speak to people's hearts, what makes his words so powerful. He's speaking obviously in a very Christian language that all Americans could understand. Even those who opposed him would have responded to it. He's stating a very plain moral case, really, that you have put me on trial, but really I'm going to stand up here and put you and slavery on trial. And he did it with such directness and power and force, and also brevity. Like Lincoln, he said what he had to say in a relatively short time, both in his few famous public speeches, but also in his writing. And I think there's just some lessons there in how you use words.
Sure.
But I'm not sure I would take it from there to sort of grander conclusions, personally.
I think I remember somewhere in the book, too, on that point, when you're talking about his brevity, that when he started to amplify or repeat himself, he kind of started losing the punchiness of the original words and stuff.
Yeah, I was a point I made in the book that he sort of had a tendency to go on maybe a beat too far. He wasn't a perfect speaker, but what's remarkable is, for instance, when he makes his famous courtroom speech, he has no notes. He wasn't even expecting to speak at the time. He's wounded, he's been in prison, and he's sort of called on to speak and just stands up and gives what Emerson called one of the two greatest speeches in American history, along with the Gettysburg Address.
That's incredible.
Unbelievable. So, he did have a presence and a power and a staunchness that is really remarkable. So when wielded that way, yes, the word can be very mighty.
What are your plans next? Can you say what your next book project might be?
I've been writing history pieces for Smithsonian Magazine for the past year or so, which has been great. And I haven't really taken the dive into the next book yet. It's hard to find a subject, I think, particularly in American history, that has the kind of magnitude of this story, but that hasn't been also written to death. And really it has to be a subject you feel passionate about, that you are prepared to give years of your life to.
Live with that person,
and those don't come along every day, and they tend to come out of nowhere. So in all honesty, I'm open to suggestions.
Okay, good. I'll give you a
talk
couple.
about that afterwards.
Well, thanks so much for your time.
Thank
really
you.
Appreciate it.
It's a real pleasure.
Time. Thank you. Has there been a good movie on John Brown?
No. There's been some terrible ones. There's never really been a movie about John Brown, I don't think. Santa Fe Trail, he's a figure in it. There have been others in which he appears, but usually as a wild-eyed, crazy man. Actually, Midnight Rising has been optioned for a cable sort of series.
That'd be great.
Limited series. I'll be frankly surprised if it ever gets made, though. I think he's kind of too hot to handle. He's he doesn't fit the sort of Hollywood narrative. You can't make him an unalloyed hero, nor can he be a perfect villain. He is, as we discussed, is this terribly complex man, and I think that's hard to deal with. It would be. I'd like to see it made as a movie, but I'm not holding my breath on the day that John Brown, the musical, made.